Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's a pleasure to have you here for today's Counterterrorism lecture series with Ian Moss. Ian is the Deputy Coordinator for Countering Violent Extremism and Terrorist Detentions at the State Department's Bureau of Counterterrorism. In this capacity, he is responsible for managing diplomatic efforts associated with foreign transfers of custody, the detentions and repatriation of terrorists, and reintegration of former extremists. Additionally, he is responsible for developing and implementing a range of policies to counter racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, to combat terrorist use of the internet, and to prevent terrorist recruitment and radicalization to violence. So he has a lot of free time on his hands. We're thrilled to have you here today, Ian, to talk about this issue of reintegration and repatriation. We will start with your opening remarks, and then we will go to the Q&A. For those of you who are participating via the Zoom link, you'll be able to submit your questions directly via the Q&A function. That button should be in the bottom of your screen. And for those of you who are participating via YouTube, you can submit your questions via email, via the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Policyforum, one word, at Washingtoninstitute, one word, .org. Ian, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. And also thank you to your team here at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy for inviting me to join you all here today to discuss not only the progress we've made on repatriation of ISIS detainees and associated family members from Northeast Syria, but more broadly, our work to counter violent extremism. As Matt mentioned, my name is Ian Moss, and I serve as the Deputy Coordinator for Counterterrorism with responsibility for terrorist detentions and countering violent extremism in the Department of State's Bureau of Counterterrorism. So this is a complex set of challenges that we are confronted with that's presented by the populations in detention in Al Hol and Al Roj camps in Northeast Syria. And it requires urgent action and the support of the international community. This includes stabilization assistance for Northeast Syria and support for communities of return in Iraq and Northeast Syria, programmatic support for disengagement, rehabilitation, reintegration, and importantly, also repatriation. And on repatriation, we've engaged intensively on the diplomatic front, particularly over the last year. And as a result, we have seen significant progress. Over 3,000 individuals have been repatriated, primarily in 2022. And that's more than the two previous years combined. And they've gone to a number of different countries, including Albania, Barbados, Canada, France, Iraq, Kosovo, Kyrgyzstan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sudan, Spain, and Slovakia. This effort continues, and we anticipate that this year alone, at least 25 countries from different regions around the world will conduct at least one repatriation operation. Already in 2023, 10 countries have repatriated more than 1,300 of their nationals. We thank all of our partners for their support, but particularly the government of Kuwait, which continues to play an indispensable role in repatriation operations by serving as a transit hub for U.S.-assisted repatriations. Because of these efforts, hundreds of children are now out of harm's way and able to live the safer lives that they deserve, lives away from the daily threat of ISIS's violent ideology. Instead, these children finally can live where they have access to education and opportunity to build their lives and pursue their dreams. Additionally, I'd like to note the leadership that two partners have demonstrated. Both Kosovo and Iraq have repatriated hundreds of fighters in 2022. While repatriation of women and children is important and urgent, the hard truth is that countries must also repatriate men and youth in detention and rehabilitation centers. Repatriating these individuals ultimately poses a much lower risk than leaving them in Northeast Syria. 10,000 ISIS fighters remain in custody there. This is the largest concentration of detained terrorists anywhere in the world. ISIS continues to look for new opportunities to replenish its ranks by trying to free these thousands of detained fighters. If they escape, they will pose a threat not only to Northeast Syria and our de-ISIS efforts there, but they'll also pose a threat to the region and to our homelands. The best way to prevent this is to repatriate these individuals so they can be rehabilitated, reintegrated, and where appropriate, prosecute. The situation on the ground is tenuous, and jailbreak attempts like the one in Hasaka at the Hasaka Detention Center in January 2022 may very well happen again. Caring for the displaced persons in camps and managing the detained fighters places a strain on the Syrian Democratic Forces, our local partner in the fight against ISIS. I want to add, reducing the population in both the camps and detention centers not only makes us more secure, but also makes the problem more manageable, including by facilitating access by humanitarian organizations to provide the needed services that individuals who are awaiting return to their communities of origin need. I also want to address head-on the key challenge to repatriations from Northeast Syria. It is not technical, it is political. We hear time and again leaders say their domestic publics oppose repatriation. They argue that the fighters, if they are successfully prosecuted, could risk radicalizing prison populations. They also express concern that returnees who are unable to be prosecuted could plan future attacks or promote violence. They also fail to see fully the humanity in the innocent children who comprise more than half of the total population in the camps, and assert that these kids will pose a security risk to communities if and when they are returned. The risks of radicalization to violence and recidivism are real. However, these risks must be balanced with the alternative, the possible resurgence of ISIS, which at its height controlled a geographic area larger than the United Kingdom, committed atrocities in areas under its control, and planned and both planned and inspired terrorist attacks around the globe. That's why we must hold perpetrators accountable for any crimes that they commit or that they have committed. We must rehabilitate and reintegrate those who cannot be prosecuted. This is a collective action problem. If we work together, we can reduce the risk that we all face. We can not only mitigate the risk each country faces individually in bringing its nationals home, but we can reduce the risk of an ISIS resurgence that, again, threatens us all. Increasingly, we are also seeing successful investigations and prosecutions, both in the United States and abroad. They really demonstrate the efficacy of our judicial systems to hold members of ISIS to account for their actions. Germany, the Netherlands, France, and Sweden, among others, are investigating and prosecuting ISIS members. Our European partners often participate in joint investigation teams, or JITs, to compile evidence to build stronger cases. We have seen a number of examples of successful investigations and prosecutions. The German Federal Court of Justice recently affirmed the 2021 sentence of Taha al-Jumali to life in prison in November 2021 for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes committed against Yazidi victims. Germany also convicted his wife, Jennifer Winnish, who was an ISIS member, for aiding and abetting crimes against humanity for her involvement in the enslavement, abuse, and killing of a 5-year-old Yazidi girl, as well as the enslavement and abuse of the child's mother. The higher regional court in Munich sentenced her to 10 years in prison and is considering adding to the length of the sentence based on the gravity of the offense. We know our justice systems are up to the task, and we have frameworks to hold people accountable. On January 10th, 2023, Spain repatriated 13 children and 2 women from Northeast Syria. The women, who were brides of ISIS fighters, were arrested upon their arrival to Torreon Air Base outside Madrid. The judge ordered they be held in pretrial detention without bail on charges of joining a terror organization, ISIS. The judge emphasized the pair participated in activities supporting Daesh before and after moving to the Syrian-Iraqi conflict zone with their husbands in mid-2014. In February 2023, the Netherlands announced it plans to prosecute a Dutch woman, Hasna Arab, for membership in a terrorist organization who, along with 11 other women, was repatriated from Northeast Syria in November 2022. She will also face charges of crimes against humanity for enslaving Yazidi women. Domestically, the U.S. continues to prosecute members of ISIS. In the landmark case, the Beatles, which many of you here and joining online have heard of, for example, the jury convicted El-Shafi El-Sheikh on hostage taking that resulted in the deaths of 4 U.S. citizens, James Foley, Kyla Mueller, Stephen Sotloff, and Peter Kasich, as well as British and Japanese nationals, all who were in Syria. El-Sheikh was sentenced to life in prison. Now, turning to our work to prevent and counter violent extremism, or PCVE, I'd like to touch on the strong partnerships the Department of State has developed to advance these efforts, which includes engagements with local and national government officials, law enforcement, mental health professionals, social workers, community and civil society leaders, really everyone who cares about and is invested in keeping us safe. So from the Strong Cities Network to Mother Schools, the programs we support around the world promote whole of government and whole of society approaches to PCVE. In addition to countering threats from Islamist terrorist organizations such as ISIS and Al Qaeda and their affiliates, we have elevated countering white identity terrorism and anti Semitism, what we refer to as racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism, or RIMVY, as a top priority. We have all seen how RIMVY incidents can inspire similar movements in other countries. The storming of Brazil's government offices in January and the arrest of coup plotters in Germany in December are examples of the direct and indirect influence American movements, whether based in RIMVY, anti-government, or conspiracy theorist ideology, the impact that they have. This is why we have supported transatlantic dialogues through the Strong Cities Network. Such discussions among policymakers and practitioners from the United States, Canada, and Europe have helped us identify transnational trends and best practices for countering RIMVY. Last May, the Department of State and the Department of Justice launched the Counterterrorism Law Enforcement Forum, which was co-hosted by the government of Germany in Berlin. This two-day event brought over 100 law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and other criminal justice practitioners from over 40 countries to build an informal global coalition focusing on locales where RIMVY groups, networks, and actors are known to have been active. The Counterterrorism Law Enforcement Forum will meet again in Oslo this summer in June. In the summer of 2021, the International Institute of Justice and the Rule of Law, the IIJ, launched a criminal justice practitioner's guide to address RIMVY. To implement the guide, the IIJ is now holding a series of roundtable discussions for criminal justice practitioners and other law enforcement and policymakers. I am participating in one of these roundtables next week in Malta, which is focused on addressing RIMVY in the security sector. Last September, in partnership with Norway, the Global Counterterrorism Forum produced a RIMVY toolkit, a useful resource for the international community in addressing challenges associated with RIMVY through a whole of society approach, and informed, again, by perspectives from government authorities, the private sector, civil society, academia, local community leaders, which is really, really critical, civic institutions such as schools and places of worship. Keeping other countries and the United States safe from terrorism requires all of us to work together. We recently commemorated the 10-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon attack, which left 3 dead and hundreds others injured. While we remember those who we lost that day, we must also encourage the resilience of survivors and families and the friends of the victims. One of the runners injured that day, Dave Fortier, founded an organization, One World Strong, designed to connect survivors of terrorism around the world. We at the State Department have sent Dave to more than a dozen countries to share his story and to expand his network of survivors and practitioners. We also recently partnered with One World Strong and our mission in Canada on a sports diplomacy event that engaged over 2,000 young people, all from Quebec City. Such engagements highlight the dynamic partnerships we're building around the world that are critical, again, to our effort to counter these threats. These examples and many others again, really highlight how central those partnerships are, especially with civil society, as we work to counter violent extremism. So I thank you all for listening to me, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. That was great. I'd like to open up with a few questions and encourage people to send in their questions. If you are on the Zoom, you can do that directly through the Q&A function. And if you are participating via YouTube, you can send in that question to the email address policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. First of all, I want to give a shout out to Dave Fortier, who's a wonderful guy. And as a Bostonian and the government's expert witness in the Tsarnaev trial, I think it's really important to give a shout out to people who suffered through that and used it to be a force of good. So
Indeed.
Shout out to Dave. I also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dvora, who helped organize this and give her the opportunity to ask a question that she submitted first. So we talked about the need to rehabilitate returnees when possible, and when appropriate to prosecute them. But not all countries have the same legal avenues that we have, and not all cases lend themselves to the necessary evidentiary basis, so that there will be people, and by the way, men and women, who should be prosecuted, but for one reason or another, because of the nature of the particular legal system or because of the nature of the evidence available, they can't be prosecuted. How should allies deal with that kind of a problem?
Matt, thank you very much, and Devor, thank you for all of your help putting this together and for this question. I mean, I think that actually gets to, again, one of the central sticking points as we engage our partner governments on repatriation, particularly of foreign terrorist fighters. The reality is, Matt, just as you stated, there will be people who cannot be prosecuted for whatever reason. That said, we engage our partners, and we have provided and will continue to provide assistance to include the compilation of battlefield evidence and general help in building cases against individuals that are in need of repatriation. One of the things that we emphasize, and why these dialogues are so critical, and the partnerships that we have are so critical, is while appreciating that we may not in all cases have frameworks that are 100% effective when it comes to potential prosecution. We should certainly take from those instances and evaluate where it is that we can where and how it is that we can strengthen those frameworks. Again, however, the reality is some of these people who we're talking about right now may not be able to be prosecuted, but as I mentioned in my remarks, the alternative, unfortunately, is that they stay where they are, and that, quite honestly, is not sustainable, and ultimately presents a threat to the very countries that are grappling with whether or not to repatriate the individuals. So it's better to have them back at home, where they can be more directly subjected to the jurisdiction in the event that they were to do something else, and potentially also, there's an entire society that can, and actors at all levels that are able to see signs of radicalization, and the individuals, if they were, for example, to engage in nefarious activity, could potentially report that.
So one of our participants asks as a follow-on to this, would the U.S. support the establishment of a special tribunal for detained ISIS foreign fighters inside Syria, a proposal called for by the SDF-led autonomous administration in northeast Syria?
So the view of the United States government, first and foremost, is that, especially with regard to third country nationals, their home nations have judicial systems, and those systems should be used to prosecute the individuals. The types of concerns that we just discussed with the first question, I think certainly would apply to any tribunal that would be established in northeast Syria. That said, we're also looking at all options to include the possible prosecution of individuals in northeast Syria. But again, the institutions most capable of effectively prosecuting those cases are found elsewhere.
So I think it's likely that some of the people who are participating today might think that the two halves of your job title are maybe not mutually distinct, but maybe don't flow into one another. But I think that the issues of terrorist detention, repatriation, reintegration on the one hand, and preventing and countering violent extremism in the other, maybe aren't so contradictory. How do you see the relationship between these two halves of your professional personality?
I think they fit hand in glove, to be honest. So first and foremost, the same experts and the same relationships and connections that we seek to build as we help governments increase their capacity to rehabilitate and reintegrate individuals when they return are also the same experts and relationships that are necessary to conduct effective preventive work. So it's we want to build these capacities such that we are not ultimately looking to repatriate individuals and reintegrate them. Rather, we're trying to build a capacity to prevent them from leaving in the first place.
Yeah. A little bit of an elephant in the room question. You and your team do a lot of work on preventing and countering violent extremism, including of the white identity and more broadly REMV nature outside the United States, around the world. As I travel the world and talk to counterparts on this issue, one of the things I hear a lot is how much of a problem REMV is stemming from the United States, and how, in the opinion of many, whether it's servers or ideologues, that the U.S. is not doing enough domestically and has become kind of a net exporter of some of this ideology. Do you hear this in your interactions with foreign counterparts, and how do you address that?
Yes, we do hear that, and it's not wrong. So first, let me let me address one point at the outset. You had mentioned kind of servers, for example, located here. We have sustained engagement with the tech sector, and including the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism, as well as individual companies, just to make sure that we have a free-flowing dialogue on this very issue. It's really critical that companies both strengthen and enforce their own terms of service. That's first and foremost. But to the core of the question, you're absolutely right, and what these kind of criticisms are quite honestly true. A lot of this ideology does emanate from the United States, which I think also places on us a particular responsibility to address it abroad. I know that the Biden-Harris administration is certainly taking very, very seriously the domestic terrorism threat, and indeed has released a strategy on that front, which includes strong partnerships and certainly a role for the State Department in making sure that we communicate with our partners and allies our understanding, one, of our own responsibility as it relates to the propagation of this ideology, and to use our strength and influence to try to increase cooperation and leverage the counterterrorism framework that we built over the last 2 decades to address this new threat. Or I don't want to necessarily say new threat, but a threat that we have, I think, woken up to, certainly here in the U.S.
So we're getting a few questions that are coming in about specific countries. Let me get to a couple of those. You mentioned Kosovo, for example. Kosovo has repatriated people. It has also prosecuted individuals, particularly repatriated women. But in those cases, it has not sentenced them to any time or any significant time. Is that a problem? Is that an issue? Is that a success? What is it more broadly about Kosovo's program that you like?
So first off, I think I mentioned that the most significant impediment to progress on repatriations is political will, and Kosovo has been a leader and has overcome whatever reticence there was to repatriate people. And the reality, as we talked about a few minutes ago, is that sometimes prosecutions are more successful than other times. But importantly, Kosovo recognized that at the end of the day, it felt that the potential threat that it may face was greater by leaving its nationals in Northeast Syria. And so you work with the justice system that you have. And so they prosecuted individuals, and perhaps they haven't resulted in very, very long sentences. Some have, certainly not all, but that also created opportunities for engagement, both on the rehabilitative side and then on the reintegration front as well. and Kosovo continues to offer its assistance to other governments. We actually hold Kosovo out as an example on those efforts.
My colleague Aaron Zelen, who literally wrote the book on jihadism in Tunisia, asks a question about Tunisia, which has had one of the largest mobilizations, but isn't particularly interested in bringing people home. And on top of that, the U.S. government's relationship with the government in Tunisia is maybe not what it once was, to the extent that it warranted a kind of off the hand mention in the worldwide threat testimony. How do we deal with a country like Tunisia?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for writing the last word on it. We appreciate it. It informs our efforts. Look, this is, there are a range of dynamics in bilateral relationships and multilateral organizations that impact our ability to engage and to meet objectives. That said, we will continue to plug away at it. But there are real challenges, certainly in Tunisia, as there are in other places. But again, one of the main challenges, quite frankly, the main challenge is political will. The United States, as well as other multilateral organizations, including civil society organizations, are committed to providing expertise and assistance to help countries like Tunisia rehabilitate and reintegrate their nationals once repatriated. But it requires sustained engagement, and we are not writing anybody off, and we'll continue to work with the Tunisians to increase that capacity and to get over that political will hurdle.
So not too long ago, there was a U.S. CENTCOM delegation that went to the region, and after visiting Al Hol and Rouge, it now appears that there may be more Americans there than we thought before. Is there something going on to try and deal with those individuals? And I mean, it seems to me we need to be doing all we can to repatriate Americans if we're going to go about asking everyone else to do the same.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So far, if my number is correct, I believe we've repatriated 39 individuals from Northeast Syria, and have had a number of prosecutions as well. Whenever we find out that there is an American citizen, that is certainly a priority for me and for my team and colleagues across the department. We do everything we can to bring folks home, whether that's women and children, or other individuals who are in detention, whether they might be whether they're known foreign terrorist fighters. We work with our interagency colleagues as appropriate as they work to develop cases and potentially prosecute those individuals for whom they can bring charges against. But certainly, whenever we find out about an American that is in the camps, and look, one thing is certain. The only thing, frankly, that is certain or has been consistent is this imprecision in the numbers that we see. So we unfortunately aren't able to say definitively that there are no Americans, but we can say what we can say is whenever we find out that there are Americans, and we are currently working on repatriating Americans right now, we prioritize that effort.
We do know about the known unknowns.
We
Yes.
do.
So here's another kind of elephant in the room question. Is there a plan for a change in status in Northeast Syria, whether it's a political decision on the part of a U.S. administration to suddenly withdraw, or a decision to do something more or different by the Turkish government? And how does this affect the timeline for the efforts you and your colleagues are engaged in to try and get people to repatriate their nationals out of their area?
Sure. I think part of that question is probably better directed to my regional colleagues. But what I will say is there are a range of dynamics that are at play in Northeast Syria and in the region, none of which really affect the timeline of my work or my team's work. our work is urgent. So moving people out of Northeast Syria is something we're trying to do as fast as we can, and there's nothing that's going to make us move any faster. It is a priority for us.
So, another person asks, in terms of their ability to repatriate, in particular to Europe, are prison sentences in Europe long or harsh enough? Do you foresee future problems when IS members are released in the coming years in Europe?
So I think the answer to that question, the legal frameworks vary across governments. Some governments have more strict sentencing than others. I think I know governments are certainly looking at what they can do to strengthen their legal frameworks and address these issues. For example, it may not have been illegal to travel to join a terrorist organization. There are governments that have in the time since 2014 passed laws that do criminalize such activity, which gives them a hook, so to speak, to prosecute individuals who, at least after the law, undertook such action. But again, we work with, and our partners work with the systems they have. And look, the reality is people are sentenced, they serve their sentences, and then they are released. Now, there are other frameworks that, again, vary across jurisdictions that allow for more or less engagement with individuals after they are released. But what's important is that while they are incarcerated, we take steps to make sure that they are rehabilitated, so that when they are ultimately released, we've done what we can to mitigate the threat that they will continue to pose a risk. And we help governments do that as well.
One of our participants asks, part of your effort to counter violent extremism includes denying terrorists the use of the internet. Can you go into that a bit? For example, do you have capabilities to do that in-house, or do you rely on other agencies or implementing partners to do that work?
So our role is, as a State Department, is to facilitate broader conversation with our partners and allies, and to make sure that we are synced up and all appreciating the gravity of this issue. We do that through a variety of fora, including the Christchurch Call to Action, the Global Internet Forum to Counterterrorism. We also engage bilaterally. But the government elsewhere has certain tools that the State Department doesn't necessarily have. But what is most important for our work is making sure that our partners and allies, as well as the private sector and civil society, appreciate, again, the gravity of the problem, and that we have policies and certainly that we commit the type of resources we need to address this threat. That also includes making sure that there is alternative content and working with both governments and civil society and the private sector to ensure that alternative content is also out there. We are very concerned about the persistence of extremist and terrorist content online. That is, we have, I think, over the past several years, gotten a lot better. When I say we, I'm talking collectively, governments as well as, but primarily the private sector, at taking down content, particularly in the aftermath of a catastrophic event. For example, you have live streaming of attacks. The Buffalo shooter. I mentioned in my remarks, I was in Berlin last May for the first counterterrorism law enforcement forum. This was a topic on the agenda. Our colleagues from New Zealand and Australia came and talked about what they're experiencing in the aftermath of the Christchurch attack, and everyone appreciated how serious this is. And then I think it was 2 days later, the Buffalo attack happened, which just drove home what it was we were discussing while we were there. But what we want to focus on, again, we have the tools, and companies have the tools to identify content and to remove content. But we are principally worried about, at this point in time, everything prior to the catastrophic event. What it is that radicalizes an individual to violence, which quite unfortunately too frequently occurs on online platforms.
But one of the things I hear from allies when I have this conversation with them as a non-government official is a sense of a lack of urgency. It's a problem that's happening over there. It's obviously contained because they're in some type of prison. The political costs to me are too high right now. There's not a sense of urgency. But just in the past few days, we've had reports of 3 different raids that have captured or killed senior IS officials that, according to CENTCOM, were planning attacks either in the Middle East or on committees that were responsible for planning attacks either in the Middle East or in Europe. How do you describe the nature of the Islamic State threat today when you're engaging with counterparts? Is that part of your effort to kind of get them animated on a subject that for many of them, my sense is, feel this is just far away and it's contained in a place that's it's not here in my capital, let it be over there?
I think that with respect to the individuals, with respect to nationals of some of these governments, I think they do think that in part that, okay, they're detained over there, right? It's manageable. I don't necessarily think that they. My impression from my conversations and colleagues and conversations with colleagues is that's not necessarily the view with respect to the broader threat. It may be the view with respect to these individuals. But there have been, as you mentioned recently, some successful raids. I think that underscores that the threat continues and it's real. We're managing it in large part, in partnership with our local partners, which is I think really important to note. But that it continues in a sense. There has been success, which is why you don't hear about you don't hear about the threats in the same way as we did 5 years ago during the so-called caliphate. So our efforts have been largely successful, but that doesn't mean that they're over.
And to the extent when I talk to people, they do feel a sense of threat. They feel a sense of threat for tomorrow in terms of the youth who are there in these camps, living in really terrible conditions and therefore at a high likelihood of being radicalized and like the next generation of violent extremists. But I wonder if you could comment about threats or concerns that are emanating specifically through and because of places like Al Hol and Al Roj. So, for example, various UN reports have noted that ISIS has used individuals who are in the camps and are therefore in almost like a little bit of a safe haven in the camp to provide administrative functions for ISIS operatives actually on the ground in Iraq. We've heard of people using the plight of detainees as a fundraising platform. In what ways do you see what's going on by perpetuation of the existence of these camps as something that contributes to the threat even today?
So I'm going to answer this in a couple of parts. I would say first, propagandists are going to, distribute all kinds of propaganda. I mean, they're going to do that. And our foes will look at the situation in Northeast Syria. And as you noted, I mean, the situation is quite frankly dire in the camps. I mean, there are real challenges, although we're working on them in partnership with our allies to address the humanitarian situation, which unfortunately adds to, I think, some of the impact of some of that propaganda. Our efforts, I think, certainly must be focused on improving the situation for the kids. That's one of the reasons why we need to get them out of there as urgently as possible. They need to have alternatives. They don't have any hope right now. There is, as you noted, there is activity in the camps that is very concerning. That's why DoD has conducted a number of clearing operations to try to reduce, in partnership with the SDF, to try to reduce that threat inside the camps, to give individuals in the camps some space and to also give space for the provision of humanitarian assistance to the individuals in the camps. But quite honestly, I mean, it's a very, very challenging set of circumstances.
So I understand from one of our participants sending in a question, I understand that today Iraq announced the closing of Jeddah 5. Can you tell us what Jeddah 5 was, and how does this affect U.S. missions related to repatriations?
So Jeddah 5 was a location at which the Iraqi government processed individuals after they were repatriated to Iraq. It doesn't necessarily impact our efforts, or I think for the long term, the government of Iraq's efforts to repatriate its nationals. There is another center, Jeddah 1, that has quite a bit of capacity, and the Iraqis are using it. The Iraqis, again, while the numbers are large, have been steadily repatriating individuals, and they do so in the form of family units, as opposed to just one-off individuals. And we anticipate that those efforts will continue and will be certainly utilized. Jeddah 1 will certainly be utilized as those efforts continue.
I have a question that asks, how effectively do our local partners on the ground work with us in repatriations, and specifically asking this question coming off the background of reports that there were several Canadians who were due to be repatriated and then shortly before that could happen disappeared?
So our local partners are critical to repatriation more broadly, and certainly to U.S. assisted repatriations. They identify the individuals, find the individuals in the camps, and then help transport them so that we can transport them out, usually via U.S. military aircraft. I mentioned earlier the numbers are imprecise, and so you're talking about an environment that isn't as organized as one would hope. I mean, this is not your typical refugee camp, which, as a general matter, also have their own problems, but they certainly do the best they can. I know that the government of Canada is committed to repatriating all of its nationals from Northeast Syria, and the United States has assisted the government of Canada and will do so for any remaining Canadians that are there.
We spoke a moment ago about the capacity of the Iraqi government. And while late in the game, the Iraqi government clearly has been repatriating in high numbers. Are they doing that well? What are the near or even long-term implications of repatriating such large numbers so quickly? How capable are they of being able to kind of keep tabs on some of the people they've repatriated?
So there are large numbers. It's certainly not an easy task, but they have been doing so in a committed and steady way. I think one of the challenges, particularly with large numbers, is making sure that folks who are left in the camps understand what life is after they leave. This is an effort that very much involves kind of thoughtful strategic communications, making sure that positive stories are told, because there is a lot of unknown. I mean, and some of these individuals know that they are probably likely not going to be well received by the communities that they left, in part because of experiences that the community had with ISIS. But this is also a task that involves educating the communities. I mean, what we ultimately want is to build resilient communities so that this can't happen again. And part of that outreach it involves direct engagement with the communities where the people will return to. But in terms of Iraq's the efficacy of their repatriation effort, it's not easy. They're learning lessons, and they're slowly but surely getting it done. And that's frankly all we can kind of ask for. We're going to continue to support the government of Iraq in that effort. I know our partners are. There's a broad international support also for the government of Iraq. particularly given the awareness by both individual governments and kind of multilateral organizations of how central solving the Iraq piece of our whole problem is.
How do you address questions of agency among people who are detained but went maybe when they were teens? There are plenty of women who went and did horrible things. There were others maybe who were drawn by husbands. I'm not a big fan of the whole jihadi bride idea. I think it minimizes their agency. But for example, there was so much out in the public domain about ISIS and what it was doing at the time. How much responsibility do we think that, say, teens or young adults are responsible for, and how do we take that into account when we're trying to repatriate or maybe even prosecute them?
So, Matt, I think as a general matter, um, that question is best answered by the jurisdictions to which they return. But you're certainly right. There was a lot of information out there when a number of these people went, whether that was voluntarily or whether they were trafficked. And there are, there is a not insignificant number of individuals who involuntarily found themselves in the area of conflict. But I think this goes back to the discussion we have about the need for, or the topic we discussed briefly about the need for the provision of rehabilitative services. I mean, if you can't prosecute individuals, if there's not evidence, yet these individuals have to go somewhere, then we have to figure out a way to meet those needs, not just for the individuals, but for the communities to which they return, and for the broader public that, with merit, has some degree, should have some degree of concern. But that concern, again, relates to risks that I think are manageable if we actually devote some thought and resources to it.
So, next question that came in asks, can you talk more about how delays in repatriations are increasing the threat in Syria of new or resurgent violent activity, whether ISIS or something else? What metrics do you track? How serious is this simmering? And what do you want from Congress or the US to mitigate or alleviate it?
So I think right now, to the latter part of the question, what we want is we want governments to move more quickly. And that's why we're engaging intensively on the diplomatic front to do what we can to both cajole and persuade and facilitate governments in their efforts to repatriate their nationals. But there is urgency. I mean, there are a range of dynamics in Northeast Syria, not just related to ISIS, but broader security concerns that underscore the need to move quickly. And as I mentioned to your question, I forget exactly what you asked, but nothing's going to change how fast we're moving. I mean, we are the pedal is to the floor, so to speak.
Are there ways the US and other partner countries can assist the SDF to increase transparency and accuracy about the situations and numbers of different individuals in Al Roj?
I think that governments governments to varying degrees have their own information about who went, when they went. So once a government is having having in earnest a conversation about repatriation, I think that making sure that we're able to share information, the United States is willing to the extent possible to share the information we have about individuals inside the camps. I mean, I think some of the information about the men in detention is a little bit there's greater fidelity there than folks in the camps. That the camps are first of all, there are a lot more people, but I think that there are dynamics that make, for all of us, the U.S. government and our partners, make discerning with specificity, who's there, more difficult. But obviously, we're able to do it to such an extent that we can get people back to certain countries. But there are, of course, situations where there may be an individual may have dual nationality. Some of this is self-reported, so it's not an easy task. But we rely on the relationships that we've had, and as I mentioned earlier, the kind of architecture that we've been leveraging for the past 2 decades when it comes to information sharing to try to get as much specificity as possible.
Yeah, and there are other kind of basic problems, some of which are the case here too, in terms of the extent of the data that is collected about people leaving the country and whether passports are required,
Right.
That data is collected or not.
They may not have documents. They may have burned their documents,
Right.
or their documents may have been burned so that they couldn't leave. Again, going back to the kind of,
Or just more
agency
generally,
question.
since here in the United States, we don't collect that data on departure, we don't necessarily know when everybody leaves. Is it within a country's right to strip citizenship? Should countries be stripping citizenship? What are the long-term implications of this?
Our view is that countries should not. It obviously creates a set of circumstances that it leave folks stateless and stuck. We think that, again, there are that governments have the capacity to manage these individuals. It's better to deal with the problem as we see it right now, as opposed to creating another set of problems involving stateless individuals.
Yeah, I think it does get to the issue that for some states, it's sometimes a little bit easier just to make it someone else's problem.
Yeah, I mean, but the reality, I think, and I think the team thinks, is it doesn't get rid of the problem. It just creates another problem, and frankly, one that may not, arise until much later. It's better to have these. Look, I say to governments routinely, some of these folks are going to come back one way or another. They're either going to come back because you voluntarily brought them back and tried to manage them, including by rehabilitating them and actually committing resources to reintegrating them, or they may come back on their own and they may not know. The governments may not know that they came back. So it's better to do it in a controlled manner than to just leave it to chance.
The reality is that this entire discussion so far is about the low-hanging fruit, the easy targets, the ones who want to go home. So what do we do about those likely more dangerous cases of the people who don't want to go home?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if you have an answer to it. It's one that we're working on for sure. There are instances, we haven't run into a large number of them so far, where individuals have declined to be repatriated. That's certainly something that we are trying to wrap our heads around. I think the reality is that there will be, for some time, some number of individuals. I mean, you're talking about a camp of about 50-some thousand individuals, roughly 18,000 Syrians, 24,000 or so Iraqis, and then the balance being third country nationals. The reality is some of those individuals are going to be there for a long time. We need to figure out how to make sure that situation is manageable for the entity in control of the area, and also to the extent that individuals who may have rejected the ideology but fear for whatever reason returning to their home countries, that they are able to integrate into a local community. That takes a lot of work. That also requires stabilizing those local communities and making sure that they can absorb these individuals. There are a lot of dynamics there, political, cultural dynamics that make that difficult, but it is a very valid question. But so far, we haven't run into very large numbers of individuals who have declined to be repatriated.
I think two of the sticking issues there are that some of these people don't want to be repatriated because they're afraid of the reception they'll receive in their communities. And that's something that is below the threshold of prosecution. And when it gets to the level of those who could or should be prosecuted, where the flip side of the coin to repatriation could be extradition, that requires the political will that you noted earlier is absent. These are primarily political problems.
I think that's right. I mean, it also gets to the point of making sure that we are able to communicate and make information about the experiences of individuals who have been repatriated. Folks who are in the camps know that there's little to no educational opportunity. The healthcare is uh, very, very challenged. The provision of healthcare is very, very challenged. Folks know that that's not necessarily the case in their communities of origin. And our experience has been, this is in conversation with foreign partners that have repatriated individuals, that there is ultimately a sense of relief, right? They folks may face some accountability when they return, but their kids are receiving healthcare. They're in school, and universally, people want better opportunities for their children. And as I mentioned, over half the population is under the age of 12, and an even larger number under the age of 18.
Yeah, I'd put those parents who want those things for their children still under the easier box, as opposed to the kind of hardline people for whom raising their children in a particular harsh ideology is more important. I should note, especially since you said it was such a good question, that the question was not mine. It was Dora Margolin's, and after we finish here, she will solve that problem set for you. I think we have time for one last question. How large a role does mental health take in PVE programs, specifically in the US? Does the State Department work with other agencies to address this issue, meaning mental health focus in PVE programs?
Yeah, that too is a really great question. So the provision of psychosocial support is really central to the PCVE effort, and certainly in the United States, we recognize that there is overlap in our efforts at the Department of State and with our sister domestically focused agencies. In fact, we just a couple of months ago pulled together interagency colleagues from the Bureau of Prisons, from the Department of Justice, the FBI, Health and Human Services. This was the kind of brainchild of a colleague of mine who's one of our resident experts, Ramiro Martinez, who works on rehab and reintegration, to better understand what it is that we do, how we address these issues. There is specific expertise by mental health practitioners that deal with issues of trauma, and particularly trauma related to time spent in conflict areas, and those resources are more accessible in certain countries than in some countries rather than in others. But one of the entities that we partner with, the GSURF, the global, excuse me, I'm blanking right now for some reason. Global, I'm blanking.
You and me both.
In any event, GSURF is a partner that pulls together experts, not just who are experts in the provision of psychosocial support, but local and municipal leaders as well, teachers, police officers, that can all bring their skill set to bear to make sure that the needs of these individuals are met. But mental health is certainly central. I mean, this is kids in particular. I mean, this is a really traumatic environment. Some of them have seen, parents killed. Some of them have been injured themselves from, bullets or shrapnel. And not only have those physical wounds not been addressed, but the kind of associated mental aspects too have not been. So we're trying to do what we can to provide as much assistance as we can to individuals before they even leave Syria. This takes a lot of effort, but more importantly, we want to make sure that when they are repatriated, they have access to that type of care.
Well, this is an extremely complicated problem set. I'm really glad that you're dealing with it, you and your team. I want to thank you all for making this conversation possible. Marand, I want to thank in particular for Margolin and Camille and Sarah and Lauren. Ian, I want to thank you very much for taking the time, and best of luck.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Take care. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.